It is a book for anybody in India who is interested in geopolitics or international relations. In 1947, the three big decisions at that time, when India became independent, were one, to be a democracy at home, two, to be a mixed economy, which for better or for worse, and then the third was non-alignment in that early years of the Cold War, which also again was tested, particularly in the 1962 war with China. I think there has been an attempt to make the G20 a more useful mechanism for some global issues.
We are also talking about making India world third largest economy by 2030. So what are the challenges and what are the opportunities that you foresee?
Understanding the basic facts on many issues is important, and I would just encourage people to read more widely, even if there's different opinions about a particular issue.
Hello everyone, welcome to this segment Bridge the Gap. We strongly believe bridge is not just a crossing but a transformation. Today we have honorable guest Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar with us, who is Executive Director of Observer Research Foundation America, which is a foreign policy think tank based in Washington. Dhruv is also an author of renowned book Vishwa Shastra, which covers India and world, which is an introduction to India's international relations. Welcome, Dhruv.
Namaskar, thank you for having me.
We are all honored to have you on this podcast, Bridge the Gap, where we interact with thought leaders who shape our future. Today, while interacting with you, I was preparing through, and I came across your book Vishwa Shastra, which covers India and the world. Would you like to start this podcast speaking about your book?
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. My book, Vishwa Shastra, India and the World, it came out in December of last year. It is a book for anybody in India who is interested in geopolitics or international relations. It is meant for somebody who does not know much about this subject but is interested. And what I try to do in the book is three things. One is just tell the story of India's interactions with the world. And much of the book is a historical story. It tells from ancient times to the present day, goes up to 2024. What has been India's interactions with the entire world in different phases. So the first chapter, which is the longest, covers before independence. How did Indian rulers and kingdoms, again from ancient times, early modern times, medieval times, connect with? How did they think about the world? How did they? Do we have how did they trade with the world? How did they spread religious knowledge and other kinds of knowledge around the world? So I document, for example, India's interactions with China, going back in some cases almost 2,000 years, with West Asia, with the Mediterranean world, with Central Asia, and also with the colonial powers later as well. Then tell the story after independence. What were the decisions that India's leaders had to make about India's place in the world in the early Cold War and then the later Cold War years, how that changed over time. And then subsequently, what happened after 1991, India's economic liberalization, new types of relationships that were formed, including with the US, where I am now, but also with Europe, with Japan, with many others. And then also some of the challenges that India has faced from Pakistan, from China, from in its neighborhood. Is actually quite a lot on India's neighborhood as well. So the first 2/3 of the book is really that story about India and the world. Second is what is the future? What are India's challenges today? How should India try to prioritize its different objectives, and what should it do about it? So it tries to offer some practical suggestions about what I think is what India is doing also, but what India should do. And finally, it has about 250 other books at the end, which is if you want to know more about India-Israel relations, if you want to know more about India-China relations, these are some books you should read which tell you more about it. So it's meant again as an introduction. I hope that students and UPSC aspirants and regular readers will find this important, because there's a growing hunger and interest in India's international relations in India, and I think I hope this is a good introduction to that.
Thank you so much for the book's introduction, Dhruv. As you know, that India's foreign policy has shaped over the years, like from regional rivalries to like from regional rivalries, then connecting with aligning with Soviet unions, then different kind of association with US and European countries. And now India is on the verge of becoming like one of the strongest economic power in the world. So, and on this backdrop, you have written this book, like a very informative book for youngsters and like academic aspirants. So what was your motivation for this?
Huh. I've been working in this field now for 20 years. I helped, both in terms of contributing my own research and analysis, but also helping others. And I felt though there was a gap. I was living in Delhi in 2016, 2017 when I started writing this book, and I was having a lot of interactions, not actually more outside of Delhi in places like Kolkata and Pune. Actually came to Symbiosis and in Chennai and places like that. And a lot of young people, particularly students, and not students of international relations, students of law, of engineering, of different disciplines, they would come to me and say, we're very interested in understanding India as well. Where do I start? And I would always have to give them a list of 5, 6 books. If you want to know more about Nehru's foreign policy, please start here. If you want to know more about India's nuclear program, read about this. But there wasn't a good book I could recommend which brought it all together and spoke to an audience that was not a specialist audience. So in some ways, I felt I needed to write that book. So I did that. I did much of the research in 2016 to 2018. Then, because of a number of things, I moved. I started a new job, but also the pandemic, coronavirus pandemic, India-China clashes, Ukraine war. So a lot of developments took place, and I decided to update a lot of that and present it, I think, in this manner. So I think the primary motivation was my own discussions with a lot of particularly younger Indians, and to a lesser degree, people outside of the country who wanted to know, how do I understand where India is fitting into the world? This is what will soon be the third largest economy. It is the largest country in the world by population. We want to understand where does India see itself in the world. So this is partly why I wrote the book.
Interesting. Like you just mentioned about India-US relationships, India-Pakistan relationship, India-China relationships on the geopolitical map, how India is like aspiring to become the third largest economy in the world. So how does India balance its democratic principles with pragmatic requirements of realpolitik in increasingly multipolar world across the globe? How do you envision this?
It's a challenge. I mentioned that even in 1947, the three big decisions at that time when India became independent were: one, to be a democracy at home; two, to be a mixed economy, which for better or for worse, and there were in the long run, I think there were some of the challenges associated with that. And then the third was non-alignment in that early years of the Cold War, which also again was tested, particularly in the 1962 war with China and after that. But today, I think it's different. I think obviously India is a vibrant, proud democracy. I think that is there. It has a set of democratic principles. It does inform its external interactions. That is, you can see already that India is much more consultative in its international policies than many other powers are. You saw that at the G20, for example. You've seen that even in multilateral summits, non-aligned movement summit meetings when they still happen in the Commonwealth. But in other groupings that India is a part of, there is a great deal of effort made to consult other countries in the region and beyond globally. As India tries to position in its place. So I think there is a democratic character to a lot of its engagements, and I try and show that in the book in some ways. But at the same time, obviously, what fundamentally I think if there's one lesson to draw, it is that international relations are determined not by norms, not by ideas, but by power. Ultimately, the more powerful countries can dictate the terms to others, and so a main argument I have in the book is that India has to invest in the fundamentals of its power. It means something again. It matters. It'll matter differently if India is the third largest economy versus the 10th largest economy from 10, 20 years ago. That will have that will shape that. But also, India needs to invest in some of the instruments of power: military power, economic power, foreign assistance. These are the kinds of things that India can use, like other countries, to compete internationally. So we are ultimately in a world which is defined by, I would say, the central characteristic defining today's world is the competition between the US and China. And this is playing out around the world in multiple domains, in the military domain, in the economic and trade domain, in the technology sphere. And this is ultimately what is shaping the world. And India has to position itself being what will soon be the third largest economy, the third most capable power, but still very much short of what the US and China are able to provide in many areas. How can India position itself in that world? And so that, I think, is ultimately what its international relations is about in the near future. This means two things, I think. One, recognizing that there is some structural competition, particularly with China and Pakistan, that is not going away, partly because of the character of China and Pakistan. But at the same time, also recognizing that you want to, as you are growing, you want to minimize the sources of conflict. And so, to the extent that you can have constructive partnerships with other powers, with the US, with Europe, with Russia, with Japan, with others, that would obviously benefit India's rise. So, I try and show it not just by talking in these broad terms, but also some specific examples in the telecom sector, in the metro rail sector, in public health, in DPI, how India has actually benefited from these external partnerships to strengthen itself.
Dhruv, you just mentioned the power dynamics in global space. You also gave example of China in that context. You also said it is very important for India to position itself in this power dynamics when we are talking about US, China, and other countries that you mentioned. So in contemporary geopolitical situation, like you spoke about multilateral forums, you spoke about knowledge exchange, technology exchange, trade, the power positioning, and all these aspects. So what you think, what needs to be prioritized from India in this, like to maybe I would say to position itself, like to show itself more political, more powerful, I would say, because a lot has been done or spoken on multilateral forums. I think in India's foreign policy narrative, that has been like most talked about. Even knowledge and technology exchange is something that we are talking about. But how, what needs to be prioritized according to you?
So I outlined what I say are five priority areas for India in the second part of the book. The first one is strengthening India at home and using foreign partnerships to do that. And the two aspects of that I focus on are the economy. So how to make yourself economically self-sufficient, Atmanirbhar Bharat, but through foreign partnerships. And I also give some examples about how that is only possible really with the use of foreign partnerships if you want to do it in an accelerated manner. The second aspect of that is strengthening yourself militarily. How do you ultimately, you for defense, national security, that cannot be forgotten. And I think we only saw that in Operation Sindoor, for example, how important that was. So that's the number first priority, strengthening oneself at home. The second is trying to ensure a peaceful, stable periphery. And this is very difficult, and I get into some of the reasons why that is. We've seen a lot of political upheaval in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, even Myanmar, Afghanistan. But what India can do to try and help stabilize this over the long term. And essentially that requires some non-reciprocal economic exchanges, and a diplomatic priority given to these regions. We're going to see volatility in these countries because of their own internal dynamics. But how do you then ensure that you continue to have a partnership? And a good example just today, in fact, or yesterday and today, has been what we've seen in Nepal. There were some natural disasters there. Prime Minister Modi actually extended support that was well received by the new Nepali government, despite the political change. So I think that is the second priority. The third is maintaining a balance of power in Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific, because there is this competition with China. And I get into the sources of the competition, how India can do that through a combination of working with other partners, integrating with Southeast Asia, securing the Indian Ocean, and through bilateral engagement with China as well, managing that relationship with China. The fourth priority is managing the Pakistan challenge, and there is a deep historical reasons why we have that challenge. It remains so. But what again India can do about that, using positive and negative incentives with Pakistan, engaging with Afghanistan. In fact, we have the Afghan foreign minister coming to India this week. and also reshaping relations with West Asia, which is again challenging given, for example, the Saudi Arabia-Pakistan relationship. And finally, it is the multilateral sphere, which is a combination of reforming existing institutions, because these existing institutions, such as the United Nations, are in some ways outdated, creating new institutions in some cases, and reaching out to the global south. And that's a combination. So I think you said, for example, that has been a priority. I think that gets a lot of attention at the United Nations. But I think ultimately the other areas I mentioned deserve equal, if not more, attention, which is particularly strengthening oneself at home, focusing on the neighborhood, prioritizing the neighborhood, and also ensuring that you're able to compete in different ways with Pakistan and China.
Interesting. Taking the thread from what you just said about competition and cooperation. So, how India can effectively balance this conflict of competition and cooperation, especially with China, when there is already like ongoing border conflict that we are experiencing?
So, there are four aspects to India-China relations. One is the border, the disputed boundary, which has been, I get into a lot into the history of why that is. There's a very different history to it in the western sector, in Ladakh, and in the eastern sector in Arunachal Pradesh. But why we have had this long-standing dispute. That is remains very competitive. A second area is China's increasing reach in South Asia, including its relationship with Pakistan, its growing role and presence in the Indian Ocean, which again is something that is a challenge for India in the long run. So how India can compete in this sphere will remain competitive. Now, two other areas I think were traditionally more cooperative, but have become more competitive in time, and I think these are the areas we will see possibly, if China is acting in good faith, some areas of renewed convergence with China. But again, it depends on Beijing in many ways. One is on bilateral economic cooperation, where what we had hoped, I think, many years ago, that India and China could grow together. We have instead seen Chinese manufacturing resulting in dumping, which has actually come at the expense of Indian jobs. So we have a large trade deficit with China, and I think one of the things to repeatedly bring up with China is we need a fair playing field for trade, bilateral trade there. Also on the investment side, that there are national security concerns about Chinese ownership of Indian companies and investment in certain areas. There are certain areas that are not sensitive. And so I think distinguishing between defining what is a sensitive sector, say semiconductors is a sensitive sector, infrastructure is a sensitive sector, but other white goods are not necessarily. So I think defining where there are areas of potential economic cooperation and where there will continue to be concerns. And then finally, I think on the multilateral sphere, previously we had seen some areas of cooperation between India and China, including on climate negotiations, on trade negotiations, on international intervention. But increasingly, I think we've seen divergences there. And China, particularly at the UN, at the Nuclear Suppliers Group, has actually blocked India's ambitions in these places. So I think these are some of the areas where you could see some progress, some cooperation. But overall, we have seen the relationship become much more competitive over the past 10, 15 years.
You just mentioned like creating that demarcation of sensitive issues and non-sensitive issues when you are dealing with China, and just to create that demarcation. But as we all know that China's influence is growing day by day in Southeast, like South Asia. And at the same time, we like as India, we are also talking about regional stability, and we are also talking about neighborhood first policy. So like how to handle this, I mean, at the same time we are also talking about power dynamics. Don't you think it's like too many things and conflicting each other?
No, not at all. In fact, I think a big reason why the neighborhood first approach came up was because of China's growing influence in South Asia. That is, for many years, India was concerned about other actors, the US in the past, Soviet Union, Pakistan, having influence in many of these countries and acting, not just having influence, but using that influence in ways that were inimical to Indian interests. So there were concerns if in Sri Lanka in the 1980s, for example, that the US would be more involved, and partly India's intervention there was a way to preempt, to stop US intervention. The China, I think, is now today arguably the second most influential country in most South Asian countries outside of India. But its influence is very different in each place, and I think it is not a one size fits all. In Bangladesh and Pakistan, it started off as a military to military engagement by China that has now become much more broad based economic as well. In Sri Lanka and Maldives, it was primarily economic Chinese investment that led to a greater influence over time, including political influence over time. In Nepal, it was primarily started off as political engagement by China with the communist parties in Nepal. And so I think it looks very different in different countries. Even to this day, Nepal is still less economically dependent on China than, for example, Sri Lanka was prior to the economic crisis. So I think we need to understand a little bit what is driving a lot of these countries to look to China for support of various kinds, whether it's economic support, military support, or political support. And that requires then India to engage differently with these countries. And again, part of it is I think there needs to be a certain humility on the part of India. We need to understand what it is that is driving Kathmandu or Dhaka or Colombo to seek alternatives, and then in some cases provide that alternative. And in many cases, I can think of a few examples in the past where certain countries in South Asia turned to China for military equipment, and their argument was that India did not have anything to offer. So today, I think we're in a better place for India to offer alternatives. Still, sometimes for a variety of reasons, they turn to others. But I think at the very least, competing means having to offer some things, whether it's foreign assistance. So, for example, just in the last few years, India has offered perhaps the largest bilateral financial package to Sri Lanka after it underwent a major economic and fiscal crisis in that country. In Nepal, India has again been sometimes the first aid provider. Relations with Bangladesh are particularly difficult at this point of time after the change in government, but the longer term interests of the trade convergence connectivity will ultimately mean that Bangladesh will have to look at some kind of stable relationship with India. So I think not closing those doors, but also being very clear about when these countries do things that are inimical to Indian interests. And because we have overlapping ethnic groups in these places, the politics of these countries does become embroiled with the politics of India as well. So it is not something that India can be a passive actor in. So I think that understanding has to be there. There's a lot of dialogue going on. ORF, my organization, does a lot of that. Others do as well. But we need to do a lot more to increase that people-to-people's engagement between India and other South Asian countries.
Yeah, you just mentioned about financial assistance, military assistance being extended by China. You also mentioned like how India can play a role by maybe extending political, not exactly financial support, but sometimes extending support
financial support as well. I mean, if you look at aid, the largest recipient of lines of credit by India, by the Indian Export-Import Bank, has been Bangladesh. The largest bilateral recipient of financial assistance, from the finance ministry to finance ministry, has been Sri Lanka. The largest recipient of grant assistance by the Ministry of External Affairs has been Bhutan, and second has been Nepal. So it has actually been quite significant financial assistance that India has provided all these countries, although different in each case.
Yeah, but is there anything else apart from military, finances, political, in beyond this influence? Is there anything, any other measures that which are becoming important? You also mentioned about trade, but is there anything else which is becoming important in current geopolitical space, which measure India can take?
No, so I think a lot more. I think the other aspect is people-to-people exchanges. Like with Nepal, we have an open border. Bhutan, we have very strong people-to-people engagement. But in other places like Bangladesh, for a long time, there wasn't as much as there should have been. There was until last year, there was an increase actually. With Sri Lanka now, there are direct flights to many places in Sri Lanka outside of Colombo, which was not true a few years ago. So I think these have been attempts to make it easier to facilitate that. We have more student exchanges. Currently, this week there is a delegation of Bangladeshi journalists who are in Delhi. They met with the foreign secretary. So that is the kind of thing we need much more of, because I think we need that understanding, two-way understanding as well. So there are other things that India can offer. But I think also for those countries to understand Indian perspectives is also important.
We are talking about global geopolitics in South Asia, across globe. Multilateral forums play very crucial role in shaping this geopolitical relationship across globe or even within South Asia. So my question to you is, as a foreign policy expert, because the geopolitical equations, even the trade equations, are changing in last. I mean, they have been changing in last few years, and the change is now visible. It's impacting our day-to-day lives also these days. So, how these multilateral forums and their dynamics is changing? How do you see it?
I'm personally very skeptical of many multilateral forums. It's not that they don't serve a purpose; they do, but many of them have outlived their purpose. They no longer function in the way that they were intended. The United Nations being chief amongst them. This doesn't mean India should disengage from the UN, but I think these calls for reform of the UN are getting louder. And I was 2 weeks back at the UN General Assembly meeting. We had some side events there, and the degree of skepticism is very high, including from the US, which was the main creator and sponsor of this institution. It is not just the United Nations. I think even something like SARC in South Asia, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, it has a headquarters, it has secretariat in Kathmandu. It has India and Pakistan as members, but for basically for 10 years, its agenda has been dormant. It still does some technical work, such as data sharing, things like that, some student exchanges, but SARC is really not functioning the way it was meant to. So all of this is requiring investments in new types of institutions. India is now putting as much resources behind some BIMSTEC, which is another regional grouping that excludes Pakistan, but includes Myanmar and Thailand. So that is that is an example. You're also seeing India doing more in existing forums. The International Solar Alliance is an example of an international organization that India has helped to create and is funding, and the headquarters is in Delhi, or outside Delhi. So I think these are just some examples of how multilateralism is changing. But I don't think that is the solution. To all of the world's problems. Increasingly, a lot of things, for example, trade, are now being dealt with mostly on a bilateral basis rather than in a multilateral setting.
We like. So, do you see any new institutions shaping up in in the context of multilateral forums?
I think there has been an attempt to make the G20 a more useful mechanism for some global issues. And I think there was a series of relatively successful summits that were led by Indonesia, then India. It has become more difficult primarily because the US, frankly, is quite less interested in, although next year the US will actually be the host in the chair. So we'll see what they decide to prioritize in the G20 presidency. But that there was some attempt at actually using that as a more useful international forum. But frankly, because it includes most of the major powers, including the U.S., Russia, China, India, again, European powers, but also many from the global South. So unfortunately, I think we're at a low point for multilateral governance. And again, India is trying its best through existing forums, through reforming them, making use of some new ones, but also creating a few new institutions as well, both regional and global. The most prominent examples, I think, are there are 3 institutions that India is hoping to be the headquarters of: the International Solar Alliance, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure (CDRI), and the Global Biofuels Alliance as well. So hopefully, there's more investment in those institutions.
Like we are talking about US, and Ashley Taylor has recently critiqued India's power delusions, and he also suggests more alignment, like closer alignment with US for India. So, what are the risks and benefits that you see in this association with US?
Well, I actually have a response to Dr. Tellis in the latest edition of Foreign Affairs, the magazine, and he responded to my response as well. I as well as former Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao and Lisa Curtis, who's another analyst based in the U.S., all had responses to him. So I write about it there, the problems I found with his argument. The biggest problem, I would say, is that he is suggesting that India needs to enter into alliance with the US. but overlooks the fact that the US is not offering India an alliance. In fact, the US has not offered a bilateral alliance with any country since 1960. That was Japan. That formalized in 1960. It has done some NATO expansion, added most recently Sweden and Finland to NATO, but beyond that, it has not offered that kind of alliance to any country. So there is not, because an alliance is not on offer, it seems strange to criticize India for not accepting that. Instead, what I say is, short of that kind of formal alliance that he talks about, there's a lot that the US and India can do together and are doing together. And he also overlooks a lot of that. So I think there's a lot more that can be done on military to military exchanges and exercises. There's a lot more that can be done on critical technologies, both military technologies, but also civilian applications, such as space, telecom, semiconductors. In many areas, the constraint is not on the Indian side, it is on the US side. So today, it is actually the US that is more holding back on a better trade relationship with India. It is not India that is asking for that. It is the US that is putting tariffs on India. So I think that it sort of misreads the international mood. It misreads the mood in the US, frankly. And so I think those are some of the shortcomings of that argument there. There are other aspects he gets into on the Indian economy. I think it again overlooks a lot of the recent developments in that sphere, and also so on the domestic side as well. So I think again it's an article that got a lot of attention because of where it was published, also the profile of the author. But that being said, I'm not sure that is the most valid critique of. There's a lot to criticize about India's role in the world, but I'm not sure that is the best or most valid approach.
Thank you for thank you for explaining this in detail, Dhruv. You emphasize that foreign policy will have to begin at home. So, what capacities and what reforms are required to achieve India's aspirations in global space?
In fact, that's such an important issue, and it has a very prominent place. But I don't go into a lot of detail on purpose because I felt there's a whole. It is some ways beyond my expertise, but it also could go into so many different areas. We need. There's so much to be done in fields such as agriculture, education, manufacturing. But I try to focus on a few areas. I think developing a manufacturing base is critical. For many years, there was a belief that India could grow without creating a domestic manufacturing base. And I think the combination of the coronavirus pandemic, the India-China clashes of 2020, and the Russian war in Ukraine have reinforced the need in India, the understanding that there are certain capacities that India needs to build domestically, particularly for a market of its size. So India cannot escape this. India essentially cannot grow beyond a point unless it is to continue to have key vulnerabilities without that domestic manufacturing base. So that there's a lot of focus on that. Secondly, related to that is focusing on key critical and emerging technologies. The reason being for two reasons. One is this will be the drivers of growth in the future. Key digital technologies, for example, new energy technologies, and such will be the key drivers of growth in the next decade or two. But also because many of those same technologies are dual use. They have both civilian applications, but also military applications as well. And so, and it'll be increasingly hard to distinguish between them. The same semiconductors that can be used for automotive vehicles can also be used in a variety of military functions as well. So these are the areas I highlight and spend a little bit of time on. But again, it can apply to a whole number of sectors, infrastructure, a wide variety of areas. Some of that will come organically, but I think if you are to say what should be the priorities today, I highlight we need to have a manufacturing base. How can we accelerate that, and how can we focus on key critical and emerging technologies? A lot of the work we are doing at ORF America is actually on these areas. How can we use external partnerships, not just in the US, but in Canada, Europe, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Australia, the Gulf, to actually help accelerate that manufacturing base and the absorption of critical technologies in India.
So manufacturing, like creating manufacturing hubs and technology that you spoke about, we are also talking about making India world third largest economy by 2030. So what are the challenges and what are the opportunities that you foresee?
I'm positive that we'll get there soon, and that's partly because the drivers of that growth today in India are two things: consumption, consumer, and we have a growing consumer base, which is growing organically because of demographics and other things, opportunities, and the second is the services sector, right? We are still a very services driven economy. So that will happen. The question is, if you do that without any intervention, then you will be again a services and consumer driven economy. You will continue to have a large trade deficit. You will see, you will have continue to have vulnerabilities in certain key areas without a manufacturing base, and you continue to have underemployment because people will move out of agriculture but not have sufficient jobs in the services sector. So I think for all these reasons, again, the only answer it seems is to focus on manufacturing, focus on industrialization, and then with a particular emphasis on the critical and emerging technology sector.
You are, like we spoke about your book Vishwa Shastra, like in this podcast, and your book challenges the notion that India lacks strategic culture. How do you look at these ancient texts like Arthashastra and centuries of diplomatic traditions that India has? What do you think that how do they shape Indian foreign policy?
So that's a very good question. I think the question I get that a lot is, why does that thinking in the past matter? And I think it does matter. When people, I'll give you some examples. When people read about sort of history of strategic thought globally, they'll give examples which are, Greek, the ancient Greeks, Europeans to a lesser degree, Mesopotamia, China now to some extent, but Indian sources of strategic thought are often overlooked. And instead, you can go back 2250 years and read Indian leaders in their own words talking about how India should interact with the rest of the world. So there is a thinking and sources of thinking that have antecedents today. How do two powers coexist? There is thinking about that, and again, sometimes in epics, sometimes in religious texts, but also very practical guides of laws, dhamma shastras, and things like that. So I do think it's important for us to even understand that there has been this thinking. Unfortunately, because we ourselves have not learned that or been taught that, it has not always influenced policymakers today, and it should. So some of the ideas that come to us today from 18th century Britain actually have, you can see parallels in that going back in a much longer tradition in India. And so I think reminding Indians that we have a longer history of the strategic thought is helpful for that reason alone. There are also, I think, things that we can learn from our history as things not to do. So why is it, for example, quite common, you will hear strategic writers and thinkers in India say India should not care about the rest of the world and focus on 8% growth. And that's a very lazy way of thinking, because I think in our own history, we show that when we did that, the rest of the world essentially colonized India, while India was domestically preoccupied. That is what slowly opened the gates to colonialism. And so I think, if anything, I think this not understanding your own history will mean that you will make mistakes again and again that are otherwise avoidable. And so for that reason, I think it's important to go back. I delve into some of the pre-independence Indian history, what we learned. There's also, I think, a very understudied period is early modern India, and I mentioned this particularly because Pune comes up a lot. There's a lot of examples I give from Maharashtra. Actually, we had traders from Nagpur trading indirectly all the way with the Roman Empire. We found Roman coins in Nagpur. I mean, that's how far it has come through the Bay of Bengal, through from the Godavari up. You have Maratha maps, battle maps from the 18th century that exist today. You have a seafaring tradition in the 18th century as well. And so I think there's a lot of it comes back to parts of India, I think, that are not always thought about as centers of international engagement. But we have a much more rich legacy than I think many Indians are aware of.
You also write that British colonialism erased India's agencies in the world. Post independence, how India's foreign policy has been shaped by overcoming these colonial disruptions.
There were a few. I mean, the colonialism left a very interesting legacy. And the way I say it is ultimately what defined it. What was different about the British colonial period was that it was an extractive period. That is, it led to the underdevelopment of India and the exploitation of a lot of its resources, including natural resources, to the benefit of the colonial power, which is Britain. But in many cases, though, we were left with various legacies, for better or for worse. You have broadly a British governance structure, bureaucratic structure, parliamentary structure, the military structure, the judicial system are all legacies of Britain to this day, of British rule. The reason we have certain trade networks, and particularly the diaspora, is again largely still a consequence of British colonialism. The reason we have Indians, ethnic Indians in Guyana, in Fiji, in Mauritius, is because of British colonialism. At the same time, that disrupted a lot of what were pre-existing patterns of engagement. So India's engagement, for example, with a lot of the West Asia was fundamentally disrupted both by colonialism but subsequently partition as well, and Pakistan becoming a separate country. And it is only now that the India, Middle East, Europe corridor is in some ways a reimagining of what was a pre-existing trading route from the Mediterranean to India, which again has a more than 2,000-year-old legacy. Similarly, a lot of our trading relationships with Southeast Asia were disrupted because you had French or Dutch colonial possessions that did not trade with India because of the colonial structure. So I think in some cases we're overcoming some of these barriers that were created, artificial barriers that were created. In other cases, it is actually because of that colonial experience that we have those relationships. The reason, again, we have particularly strong relations with certain East African countries is because there is a Indian community in Kenya and Tanzania, the English-speaking, their fellow Commonwealth countries, and it means sort of today taking advantage of that in various ways, maintaining those linkages. But in other cases, obviously, colonialism was very damaging to India's engagements with the world and certainly disrupted a lot of things. So again, it's a very mixed legacy, but for better or for worse, this is what we are dealing with today.
We have spoken about like multiple associations and global platforms that India can have. We also spoke about conflict zones such as China, like border conflict specifically, and we all are aware when it comes to Pakistan. So considering, I mean, you suggest that India should create influence in West Asia. So considering this conflict with Pakistan, how can India create balance and simultaneously increase its influence in West Asia?
This was for a long time, India's engagements with West Asia were limited because of that competition with Pakistan. India was very concerned that these countries would back Pakistan too much. For that reason, for example, India did not recognize Israel until 1992. Because there were concerns that it would have a backlash in many of the Gulf Arab countries and in the OIC, or the Organization of Islamic the Community of OIC, Islamic Cooperation. So I think that those hesitations have now been in many cases overcome. That being said, India is again trying to engage with multiple actors simultaneously: Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Turkey, who have different levels of engagement with Pakistan, for example. So, Turkey has been amongst the biggest backers of Pakistan. Qatar has supported some similar forces. At the same time, Qatar is one of the largest gas providers to India. India is one of the largest purchasers of Qatari gas. So the relationships are becoming more complex. But I think the longer term trend is to not let Pakistan be a limiting factor in engagements with these different stakeholders, whether it's with Israel on defense, whether it's with Iran on connectivity, whether it's Saudi Arabia on investment. India needs to continue to deepen those relationships because I think there are a number of factors pushing those together. So again, not allowing Pakistan to exercise a veto over some of these relationships is, I think, what has really changed over time.
Dhruv, as you represent ORF America, and you also mentioned how your think tank has been contributing in this like public policy domain, specific to foreign policies that I'm speaking about. So, how do you see this think tank, or maybe ORF is like playing role in India-US dialogue?
So we don't play a role in India-US dialogue today. The India-US relationship is very complicated, and I mean that in a good way, in the sense that you have 50 lakh people of Indian origin in the US, both Indian citizens, sorry, US citizens, but also Indian citizens, a combination of both, and some second, third generation now Indians born in the US. And the level of engagement we have, whether it's businesses to businesses, whether it is government to government, military to military, student to, and university to university, that level of engagement today is very broad. And it's the numbers again are quite I think have changed so much over 20 years ago that it's really quite hard to keep up with that. That being said, there are few problems that remain. One is the level of understanding about India in the US is still very poor, and there are almost no. There are only a handful of major research centers on India, on contemporary India particularly, and so I think a lot of the role that we have found ourselves in is just being a place that explains India with no particular agenda, but just simply explains these are the things that are happening. So whether it is how India's approach to new technologies, whether it's India's foreign investments, a lot of people simply don't know about that here. And so I think that educational uh, that education is one of the roles that we can play. The second is, I think, providing some platforms for some policy engagement. And again, because the relationship is so broad, we focus only on a few areas, a little bit on semiconductors, on energy, clean energy supply chains. So how can we strengthen some of these linkages? And some of this involves both the governments, but also private entities as well. So some of those dialogues we do. So I think those are just some of the ways I think we try to facilitate those exchanges. But it's frankly, it's early days yet. ORF America is less than 5 years old, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. We need much broader engagement between the two countries.
Dhruv, in India, we are also talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat. And like when we are talking about geopolitical equations with other countries, a lot of trade exchange, knowledge exchange, technology exchange. So simultaneously, we are talking about both the things, and we are also talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat. So what India needs to do on this front in order to maintain a balance between this global supply chain?
So, in fact, I mean, I don't see that as a contradiction. In fact, there's a chapter in my book called that precisely as well. And the reason for that is no every global power, has developed indigenous capabilities over time. You cannot be a serious global power without developing certain indigenous capabilities. That being said, almost no power in history, not the US, not the Soviet Union, not China, not Japan, has developed those capabilities entirely on its own. All of them have benefited to different degrees and in different ways from foreign partnerships, whether it is through people, and the US benefited from people emigrating to the US, whether it is through formal relationships. China initially benefited a lot from the Soviet Union, subsequently from investment from the US and market access. So all of these things, I think, I go into some other examples, Japan's changes that led to Japan's modernization. So this idea that we can build up these indigenous capabilities completely on our own is, I think, a very false idea. If you try to do that, so in many cases it takes much too long. And so I think using investment, technology transfers, market access, attracting people, all of these things are things, scaling. These are ways in which India can benefit from foreign partnerships in many different ways. And I think understanding how to do that, with what partners, how to fully take advantage of those relationships is very important. So, to be honest, India will not be able to grow to the same extent without broader market access. That's why trade agreements are so important. Without certain technology partnerships as well, without cannot indigenize. So I don't see those two objectives as being contradictory. I think they actually have to work better together in consonance together.
You also emphasize on innovations and like in uh, you also emphasize on innovations. You have been talking about technology trades. What areas of innovation and technology needs to be prioritized immediately?
So I think the Indian government has really focused on three or four key areas. One is what I call strategic technologies. That's defense, nuclear, space, being one. Second is digital technologies. This includes the hardware side, semiconductors, data centers, fiber optic cables, but all satellites, but also the software side. The third is clean, energy, new kinds of energy, including energy storage and biotechnologies. And then the fourth is in certain sort of automotive capabilities as well. And I think taken together, these have been the primary areas of investment. If you look, for example, at the PLI scheme, the production linked incentive schemes, these are the areas that get the largest government subsidies towards that. So I think there's a very clear idea that these are the areas to prioritize. Again, these will be the drivers of growth. These are the strategically significant areas that the government is actually putting money behind as well.
While we are coming towards closure of our podcast, last few questions, but like we are talking about our neighboring countries, neighborhood countries, creating a balanced, synchronized relationship with them in terms of geopolitics. There is one common thread in all these neighbor countries that we see. In Nepal, unrest; Bangladesh, unrest; Sri Lanka, unrest. No matter what the reason was, what the influence was, but the common factor was unrest among the youth. And technology, social media, all multiple factors have played role in creating that unrest and taking it to a certain level. So do you see that this kind of trend is emerging across globe, creating unrest among youth, and that its impact on geopolitical equations?
To some extent, yes. It's a little bit coincidental, but just in the past week, we have seen similar protests in Morocco, in Madagascar, in Indonesia, and the Philippines, all outside of South Asia. So there does seem to be some parallels in these places, although again, the immediate spark or the cause is different in different places. One of the trends I note is that these are countries that are all democratizing in their own ways and at their own paces. And in different ways, again, we have seen that happen, whether it's even simply the opening up of the social media space in places like even Bhutan and Nepal. That is in some ways a factor that India has to build in, and that's going to lead to short-term political volatility. So that is, I think, a longer term trend that we've seen. If you look back 20, 30 years ago, Bhutan was an absolute monarchy. Nepal was a constitutional monarchy, but in the 1980s was an absolute monarchy. Myanmar had a very strong military junta. It opened up briefly, but then again, we had a coup. Bangladesh had essentially a de facto military leadership in the 1980s under Eshab. Sri Lanka perhaps the most democratic of the countries, had very regular political assassinations, a civil war, discrimination against minorities. Maldives again was a strongman rule. So all of them have opened up in their own ways, and that sometimes means 2-3 steps forward and 1 step back. Then it's not been a linear progression. But I think that is now a factor that India has to contend with. And again, the challenge is, while continuing to expect a high degree of political volatility, how do you ensure that the people to people, the economic connect with India continues to strengthen? And that, I think, has been the challenge. I think two relative successes in that sphere have been recently Sri Lanka and Maldives, where Maldives in particular, you had a president that ran on an India out campaign, and yet has continued to work with India economically and militarily, and Sri Lanka to a lesser extent as well. You have a JVP government there now that is had a very successful visit to India recently. So I think that idea of dampening the volatility in the bilateral relationship, despite the domestic political turbulence in these countries, is something that India will have to do.
Dhruv, we have been talking about your book Vishwa Shastra. You have been interacting with students, and of course, a lot of topics that we discuss in this podcast. I see that many reforms are expected in geopolitical space, even in foreign policy space, not just for India but even for other countries. So you have already written one book, which is a guiding for students and experts or enthusiasts for foreign policy, whoever are enthusiasts for foreign policy. So what is your message from this podcast to youth of our country and across globe, from foreign policy space precisely?
I find a lot of people have opinions about lots of things in this day and age, and you see that a lot on social media. And a lot of times, I think my only suggestion is to read, and not just my book, but again, I point to 200 plus other books to read on this topic, and it's not just on this topic, on other things as well. I see so much people sort of stating their opinion, and it's quite clear from their opinion that they haven't actually bothered to understand the issue at all. And so I think a lot of complex issues in particular, trying to understand a different perspective, trying to understand that a lot of other people have cared about these same issues for many decades. That doesn't mean they've always had the right answers. So I think in some ways withholding judgment and understanding, understanding the basic facts on many issues is important. And I would just encourage people to read more widely, even if it is different opinions about a particular issue.
Taking your message to read more and more, my last question to you for this podcast is, what is your next, what next you are bringing in market for us to read?
I have 2-3 things I'm working on. It may be 1 or 2 more years before any of it sees publication. I'm constantly writing something or the other, usually shorter form. Something right now focused quite a lot on maritime security, what the implications of a US that is less interested in the world is going to be, not just for India, but for the broader international environment. So I think there's a lot more. We're doing some work, and not me personally, but at our organization, a lot more on critical minerals is one area where we'll be doing a lot more on a greening of certain industrial sectors, on emerging technologies, particularly AI has been a big focus the past year. So we constantly, for me, I think one of the things I like, particularly running an organization like this, is every day you get to engage on a different set of issues, which are all connected in some way or the other. So today we can't talk about international relations on its own anymore. It's connected to domestic politics. It's connected to the economy, macroeconomics. It's connected to trade, technology, energy flows. So today, understanding all of that is important.
Thank you so much, Dhruv. Very insightful discussion about India's foreign policy as well as about your book, Vishwa Shastra. I'm sure my viewers will be delighted to read your book and get more insights from your book about geopolitics. Thank you so much for interacting with us.
Thank you.